The stagecoach rattled into Eldorado Canyon, Nevada on a blistering afternoon in July of 1878, carrying a woman who flinched at every shadow and gripped a small derringer beneath her shawl with white knuckles. Kathryn Greene had learned the hard way that survival meant suspecting everyone, trusting no one, and keeping her secrets buried deeper than gold in these unforgiving mountains. She climbed down from the coach with her carpet bag clutched tight against her ribs, scanning the dusty street with eyes that had witnessed too much betrayal for someone barely 22 years old. The driver tossed down her trunk without ceremony, and Kathryn caught it before it hit the ground, ignoring the way her shoulders protested the weight. She had carried heavier burdens than luggage across 3 territories in the past 6 months, running from a past that chased her like a persistent rattlesnake. Eldorado Canyon was supposed to be different, far enough from Colorado that the name Sterling would mean nothing, remote enough that she could disappear into the crowds of miners and prospectors who flooded these Nevada towns looking for their fortunes. The Silver Dollar Saloon stood across the street, its painted sign promising rooms for rent on the 2nd floor. Kathryn adjusted her bonnet and started toward it, her boots kicking up dust with each step. She had almost reached the wooden sidewalk when a gunshot cracked through the air, and instinct threw her to the ground before conscious thought could intervene. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed herself flat against the hard, packed earth, memories flooding back of another gunshot, another town, another man she had trusted who had put a bullet through her father's chest for the location of a silver claim. The derringer was in her hand now, though she could not remember drawing it, and her breath came in short gasps that tasted of fear and dust. "Easy there, miss." The voice came from above her, low and steady as a calm river. "Just some drunk miners letting off steam. Nobody is shooting at you." Kathryn looked up to find a man crouched beside her, his hands held out in a gesture of peace. He wore the dusty clothes of a working cowboy, leather chaps scarred from brush, and a hat that had seen better days, but his eyes held something she had not expected to see in this harsh place. Kindness, real and unfeigned, looked back at her from beneath the shadow of his hat brim. "I am fine," she said, her voice sharper than she intended as she scrambled to her feet and tucked the derringer back into its hiding place. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment at her overreaction, but she kept her chin high as she brushed the dirt from her traveling dress. "Yes, madam, I can see that." He stood slowly, giving her space, and she noticed he was tall, maybe 6 feet, with shoulders broad enough to block out the afternoon sun. "Name is Garrett Daniels. I work the horses at the livery stable down the way. Just wanted to make sure you were all right." I said I am fine. Kathryn picked up her carpetbag and started toward the saloon again, her spine rigid with wounded pride and lingering fear. She could feel his eyes on her back, watching her go, and something about that steady gaze made her want to run even faster than she already was. The Silver Dollar provided her with a small room that overlooked the main street, bare except for a narrow bed, a washstand, and a chair with one wobbly leg. Kathryn paid for a week in advance with coins from the dwindling stash sewn into the lining of her bag, then locked the door and sat on the bed until her hands stopped shaking. The gunshot had not been meant for her. Nobody here knew who she was or what she had seen. She was safe, at least for now. She found work the next morning at the general store, where the owner's wife had recently passed and left him overwhelmed with inventory and accounts. Mr. Peterson was a gruff man in his 60s who asked no questions about her past and seemed grateful simply to have someone who could read and write well enough to keep his ledger straight. Kathryn threw herself into the work, organizing shelves and counting stock, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of numbers and order. 3 days passed before she saw Garrett Daniels again. She was carrying a crate of canned goods from the back storage when she nearly collided with him in the narrow aisle between the pickle barrels and the bolts of fabric. "Pardon me, miss," he said, stepping back quickly to give her room. "Didn't mean to startle you." Kathryn held the crate like a shield between them, her pulse jumping at the unexpected encounter. "You didn't startle me. Good." He held up a list written in careful, blocky letters. "Mr. Peterson asked me to pick up some supplies for the livery. We board horses for folks passing through, and we are running low on liniment and curry brushes." She set down the crate and took the list, grateful for the excuse to look away from those steady eyes. Something about Garrett Daniels unsettled her in ways she could not name, as if he could see past the careful walls she had built and glimpse the frightened woman hiding behind them. She gathered his supplies efficiently, wrapping them in brown paper and tying the bundle with string. "That will be $4.30, she said, keeping her voice professionally distant. He counted out the coins and laid them on the counter, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "You settling in all right? Eldorado Canyon can be rough on newcomers." "I am managing perfectly well, thank you." Kathryn pushed the wrapped bundle toward him and turned away to record the sale in the ledger, hoping he would take the hint and leave. Instead, Garrett remained at the counter, his hat in his hands. "Listen, Miss Greene, I do not mean to pry into your business, but if you ever need help with anything, the livery stable is just down the street. Red barn with white doors. You cannot miss it." "I will not need help," Kathryn said, the words coming out harder than she meant them to. "I have learned to take care of myself." Something flickered in his expression, a shadow of understanding that made her chest tighten. He nodded slowly and settled his hat back on his head. "Yes, madam, I expect you have. Offer stands anyway." He left without another word, and Kathryn stood behind the counter with her hands pressed flat against the worn wood, trying to steady her breathing. She could not afford to let anyone close, not here, not anywhere. The last time she had trusted someone with even a fraction of the truth, her father had ended up dead, and she had barely escaped with her life. Men like James Sterling were everywhere in the West, wearing friendly faces and hiding venomous hearts, and she would be damned if she let herself be fooled again. The summer heat intensified as July gave way to August, turning Eldorado Canyon into a furnace during the daylight hours. Kathryn grew accustomed to the rhythm of the town, the way miners flooded in on weekends to spend their wages on whiskey and card games, the way the respectable families hurried their children past the saloons and brothels, the way violence could erupt as suddenly as a summer thunderstorm, and then dissipate just as quickly. She saw Garrett regularly now, as he came by the store every week for supplies and sometimes just to pick up his mail. He never pushed, never asked invasive questions, but he always greeted her with that same steady kindness that made her defensive walls feel both necessary and exhausting. Other men in town had tried to court her, mistaking her solitude for loneliness, but she turned them all away with sharp words and sharper looks. Garrett never courted her, never presumed, and somehow that made him more dangerous than all the others combined. One evening in mid-August, Kathryn was closing up the store when she heard shouting from the street. She looked out to see a crowd gathering near the Silver Dollar, and her stomach dropped when she recognized the broad shoulders and familiar stance of one man in the center of the commotion. Garrett stood facing 3 miners, his hands loose at his sides, his voice too low for her to hear the words but his body language radiating calm authority. Against her better judgment, Kathryn stepped out onto the wooden sidewalk to watch. One of the miners was clearly drunk, swaying on his feet as he jabbed a finger at Garrett's chest. The other two flanked him, and Kathryn could see the potential for violence building like pressure before an explosion. "You calling me a cheat?" The drunk miner shouted, loud enough now for Kathryn to hear. "Nobody calls Dutch Morrison a cheat and walks away." "I am not calling you anything," Garrett said, his voice carrying that same steady quality it always held. "I am just saying the horse you sold to Mr. Henderson was lame when you sold it, and that is not right. Make it right, and we will have no trouble." Dutch Morrison spat in the dust at Garrett's feet. "I do not take orders from some livery hand who smells like horse shit." The crowd murmured, waiting to see how Garrett would respond to the insult. Kathryn found herself holding her breath, her hand instinctively moving toward the derringer hidden in her skirt pocket. She told herself she was just being cautious, that it had nothing to do with the sudden fear that squeezed her chest at the thought of Garrett getting hurt. "That is fair," Garrett said, and Kathryn could hear the hint of amusement in his tone. "I do work with horses all day." "But the horse was still lame when you sold it, and Mr. Henderson deserves his money back or a sound animal. That is just good business." For a moment, the situation balanced on a knife's edge. Then Dutch Morrison laughed, a harsh sound that held no humor. "You got sand, I will give you that." "Fine. Tell Henderson to bring the nag back tomorrow and I will swap him for another one. But this does not make us square, Daniels. I do not forget when someone embarrasses me in front of the whole damn town." Garrett nodded, accepting the compromise without gloating. "Fair enough. I will let him know." The crowd dispersed, disappointed that no fight had materialized, and Kathryn realized she was still standing on the sidewalk with her hand in her pocket. She pulled her hand free and turned to go back inside, but Garrett's voice stopped her. "Evening, Miss Greene." "Working late." She turned to find him standing a respectful distance away, dust on his clothes and a small cut on his cheekbone that had not been there that morning. "Just closing up. You should get that cut looked at." "It is nothing. Caught an elbow when I was breaking up a scuffle between two horses earlier." He gestured toward the store. "Mind if I walk you back to the Silver Dollar? It is getting dark and the town gets rowdy on Saturday nights." Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to maintain the distance she had carefully constructed. But she was tired of always being afraid, tired of treating every kind gesture as a potential trap. "I suppose that would be acceptable." They walked in silence for a moment, their footsteps echoing on the wooden sidewalk. Kathryn kept a careful space between them, aware of the solid presence at her side and the way other men gave them a wide berth as they passed. "That was foolish," she said finally, surprising herself. "Standing up to three men like that." "Someone needed to," Garrett replied. "Henderson is a good man and he got cheated, could not let that stand. You could have gotten hurt, or killed." He glanced at her, and even in the fading light she could see the gentle understanding in his eyes. "Sometimes doing the right thing means taking risks, but I appreciate your concern, Miss Greene." "I was not concerned," Kathryn said quickly, too quickly. "I just think unnecessary violence is foolish." "I agree. That is why I try to avoid it when I can." They had reached the entrance to the Silver Dollar now, and Garrett stopped at the bottom of the stairs. "But I won't let innocent people get trampled just because standing up for them might be dangerous." Kathryn stood on the first step, which put her almost at eye level with him. In the lamplight spilling from the saloon's windows, she could see the lines around his eyes, the weathered tan of someone who spent his life outdoors, the quiet strength in the set of his shoulders. He was maybe 25 or 26, she guessed, old enough to have seen trouble but young enough to still believe in doing the right thing. "You are either very brave or very stupid," she said softly. "Probably a bit of both." He smiled, and it transformed his face from merely kind to genuinely handsome. "Good night, Miss Greene. Sleep well." He tipped his hat and walked away before she could respond, his long stride carrying him back toward the livery stable. Kathryn stood on the stairs and watched him go, feeling something crack in the careful armor around her heart. The next few weeks passed in a blur of heat and work. Kathryn found her eyes seeking Garrett out when she knew she should not, tracking his movements through the town, noticing when he helped an elderly woman carry her packages, or when he spent his lunch hour teaching a young boy how to properly saddle a horse. He never seemed to notice her watching, or if he did, he was gentleman enough not to mention it. In early September, a telegram arrived at the general store addressed to Kathryn Greene. She stared at it for a full minute before her shaking fingers could tear it open. The message was brief and unsigned, just 7 words that turned her blood to ice. "We know where you are. Coming soon." She barely made it to the back room before her legs gave out. She sat on a crate of dry goods with the telegram crushed in her fist, trying to breathe through the panic that threatened to swallow her whole. James Sterling had found her. After 6 months and 3 territories, he had finally tracked her down. And he was coming to finish what he had started, to silence the only witness to her father's murder and claim the silver mine that should have been hers. "Miss Greene," Mr. Peterson's voice came from the doorway. "You all right? You look pale as a ghost." "I am fine," she lied, forcing herself to stand on unsteady legs. "Just feeling a bit faint from the heat. You should go rest. We are slow this afternoon anyway. I can manage without you." Kathryn nodded gratefully and gathered her things, her mind racing as she stumbled out into the afternoon sun. She needed to run again, to pack her bag and catch the next stage out of Eldorado Canyon before Sterling arrived. But she was tired of running, tired of looking over her shoulder, tired of being alone with her fear. She found herself walking toward the red barn with white doors without consciously deciding to do so. The livery stable was quiet in the afternoon heat, with most of the horses dozing in their stalls. She stood in the doorway, letting her eyes adjust to the dimmer interior, and heard the sound of someone whistling a low tune from the back of the barn. "Hello," she called, her voice unsteady. The whistling stopped, and Garrett appeared from one of the stalls, a curry brush in one hand. His expression shifted from surprise to concern when he saw her face. "Miss Greene, what is wrong?" "I need to leave town," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "Tonight if possible. Do you have a horse I could buy, or rent? I can pay." He set down the brush and walked toward her slowly as if approaching a spooked animal. "What happened?" "Nothing happened. I just need to leave." She fumbled in her pocket for the small leather purse where she kept her money, but her hands were shaking too badly to open it. "Please, Mr. Daniels. I know I have not been particularly friendly, but I need your help." "All right," he said quietly. "But you are in no state to travel alone right now. Come sit down and tell me what has you so frightened." "I cannot tell you. I cannot tell anyone." The words came out as nearly a sob, and Kathryn hated herself for the weakness. She had sworn never to let anyone see her vulnerable again, and here she was falling apart in front of a man she barely knew. Garrett gestured toward a small office at the side of the barn, and she followed him on autopilot. The office held a desk covered in papers, a wood stove for winter, and 2 chairs that had seen better days. He pulled out one chair for her and then leaned against the desk, giving her space. "Miss Greene, you have been running scared since the day you arrived in Eldorado Canyon," he said gently. "I do not know what you are running from, but I know fear when I see it, and I know that running does not always solve the problem." "You do not understand." Kathryn clutched her purse in her lap, fighting the urge to bolt. "The people looking for me, they killed my father." They will kill me too if they find me. I am not safe here anymore." The words hung in the air between them, the truth she had kept buried for 6 months finally spoken aloud. She expected him to recoil, to tell her to take her troubles elsewhere, to wash his hands of a woman with such dangerous baggage. Instead, Garrett pulled the other chair around and sat down facing her, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes. "Then we will make you safe," he said simply. "But running is not the answer, not if they have already tracked you this far. We need to end this." Kathryn shook her head violently. "You do not know what you are saying. These men are killers. They murdered my father in cold blood because he would not tell them where his silver claim was located. I witnessed it, and now they want me dead so I cannot testify against them. Then we go to the law." "The law," Kathryn laughed bitterly. "James Sterling owns the sheriff in Silver Creek, Colorado. That is why I ran. Nobody would believe me over him. He is rich and respected, and I am just a woman with a wild story and no proof." Garrett was quiet for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought. "But you are not in Colorado anymore. The law here does not know Sterling and has no reason to protect him. If he comes to Eldorado Canyon looking to hurt you, that is attempted murder, and Sheriff Hayes will not stand for it." "You do not understand how powerful Sterling is," Kathryn said, but she could hear the hope creeping into her voice despite her best efforts to suppress it. "He has connections everywhere. Money buys a lot of loyalty in the West." "Maybe so." Garrett leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his expression earnest. "But he does not have connections here yet, and that gives us an advantage. We tell Sheriff Hayes what is going on. We make sure you are never alone until Sterling shows his hand. And when he does, we will have witnesses and the law on our side." "Why would you do this?" Kathryn searched his face, looking for the hidden motive, the angle that would reveal itself too late. "You do not even know me. This is not your fight." "You are right. I do not know you very well," Garrett acknowledged. "But I know enough to see that you are a good person who has been dealt a bad hand, and I know that I could not sleep at night if I let you face this alone when I could have helped." Kathryn felt tears burning behind her eyes, and she blinked them back furiously. "I cannot ask you to risk your life for me. You are not asking. I am offering." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and covered her hand with his. His palm was warm and calloused from years of hard work, solid and real in a way that made the fear recede slightly. "I am not saying you have to trust me completely, Miss Greene. I know trust is not something you give easily, but maybe you could trust me just enough to let me help, just this once." She looked down at their joined hands, at the contrast between her pale fingers and his sun-bronzed skin. Every rational part of her brain screamed that this was foolish, that trusting anyone was how people got killed, that she should run as far and as fast as she could. But she was so tired of running, and the warmth of his hand on hers felt like an anchor in a storm-tossed sea. "I do not know if I can trust anyone," she whispered, the admission tearing something loose in her chest. "After everything that happened, after watching my father die and running for my life, I do not know if I remember how." Garrett squeezed her hand gently. "That is all right. You do not have to trust me today, but I will be here tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that. I will wait as long as it takes, Miss Greene, however long you need." She looked up at him then, really looked at him, and saw nothing but patience and determination in his eyes. No pressure, no demands, just a quiet promise that hit her harder than any passionate declaration could have. "Kathryn," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Kathryn." He smiled, slow and warm. "Garrett, though I guess you already knew that." "Yes," she found herself smiling back just a little. "Yes, I did." They sat like that for a long moment, hands joined across the space between their chairs, while dust motes danced in the shaft of sunlight coming through the office window. Finally, Garrett stood and gently released her hand, though she could still feel the warmth of his touch even after he pulled away. "Let me walk you to see Sheriff Hayes," he said. "We will tell him what is going on, and he can keep an eye out for anyone matching Sterling's description. In the meantime, you should move into the boarding house. Mrs. Patterson runs a respectable place, and she does not allow any men on the premises after dark. You will be safer there than at the Silver Dollar." Kathryn nodded slowly, letting him take charge because she was too exhausted to argue. They walked to the sheriff's office together, and she told the story again, watching Sheriff Hayes's weathered face grow increasingly grim as she described her father's murder and Sterling's pursuit. "I will send out some wires," Hayes said when she finished. "See if there are any wanted posters or warrants out for this Sterling fellow. In the meantime, Miss Greene, you stick close to town and do not go anywhere alone. If this man shows up, we will be ready for him." Over the next few days, Kathryn moved into Mrs. Patterson's boarding house and settled into a new routine. Garrett walked her to and from work each day, a silent presence at her side that made her feel protected rather than smothered. Other people in town began to notice their connection, and she heard the whispers when she passed, speculation about the pretty shop girl and the kind horse handler, who seemed to have appointed himself her guardian. "People are talking," she said to Garrett one evening as they walked back from the store. September had brought cooler temperatures, and the desert night was actually pleasant for once. "Let them talk," Garrett replied easily. "Do you mind?" Kathryn considered the question honestly. A month ago, she would have hated the attention, the sense of being watched and discussed. But now, with Garrett's steady presence beside her and the knowledge that Sheriff Hayes and half the town were watching out for her safety, the gossip felt almost comforting. It meant she was not invisible, not forgotten, not alone. "No," she said slowly. "I suppose I do not mind." They walked in companionable silence for a while, and Kathryn found herself noticing small details about Garrett that she had missed before. The way he always walked on the street side of the sidewalk, putting himself between her and any potential danger. The way he nodded to everyone they passed, regardless of their social standing. The way he seemed genuinely interested when she talked about her day, asking questions and remembering details from previous conversations. "Why are you not married?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, and Kathryn felt her cheeks heat with embarrassment. "I apologize. That was rude." Garrett chuckled. "It is a fair question. I suppose I have just been waiting for the right person. My parents had a good marriage, the kind where they were true partners. I decided a long time ago that I would rather be alone than settle for anything less than that." "That is rare," Kathryn said. "Most people marry for convenience or necessity out here." "I know. But I figure if I am going to spend my life with someone, it should be someone I genuinely like and respect. Someone I want to talk to at the end of a long day. Someone who makes me want to be a better man." He glanced at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "What about you? I know you are young, but I am surprised no one claimed your heart before." Kathryn thought about the boy she had known back in Missouri, before her father had caught gold fever and dragged her west. They had talked about marriage in the vague way young people do, assuming they had all the time in the world. Then her mother had died, and her father had sold everything to chase a dream of silver, and that simple life had disappeared like morning mist. "There was someone once," she said. "But that was a different lifetime, a different me." "Do you miss her, that different you?" The question caught her off guard with its insight. "Sometimes. She was more innocent, more trusting, but she was also naive and unprepared for how cruel the world can be. I do not think I would want to go back, even if I could." They had reached Mrs. Patterson's boarding house now, and Kathryn stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. Garrett stood with his hands in his pockets, looking up at her with those steady brown eyes that seemed to see too much. "For what it is worth," he said quietly, "I think the woman you are now is pretty remarkable, strong and brave and still kind despite everything that has happened to her. That different you might have had an easier life, but I do not think she would have survived what you have survived." Kathryn felt her throat tighten with emotion. "You barely know me, Garrett. You are seeing what you want to see, not who I really am. Maybe," he smiled slightly, "or maybe you are so used to thinking of yourself as damaged that you cannot see what everyone else sees. That you are more than what was done to you." He tipped his hat and turned to leave before she could formulate a response, his long stride carrying him back toward the livery stable. Kathryn stood on the porch and watched him go, her hand pressed against her chest where her heart beat an unfamiliar rhythm. The days turned into a week, then two, with no sign of James Sterling or his hired guns. Kathryn began to relax slightly, allowing herself to hope that maybe the telegram had been a bluff, a last-ditch attempt to scare her into revealing her location. She fell into a comfortable pattern with Garrett, their daily walks becoming the highlight of her day, their conversations growing deeper and more personal as her trust slowly, tentatively began to rebuild. He told her about growing up on a cattle ranch in Texas, about learning to ride before he could walk and spending his childhood under endless skies. His parents had died in a cholera outbreak when he was 19, and he had sold the ranch because he could not bear to stay in a place so haunted by their memory. He had drifted for a few years, working odd jobs and trying to figure out where he belonged, before landing in Eldorado Canyon and finding a kind of peace in the simple work of caring for horses. She told him about her childhood in Missouri, about her mother's gentle hands and her father's restless dreams, about the silver claim that had consumed her father's last years, the way his obsession had grown until it eclipsed everything else in his life. About the moment James Sterling had walked into their camp with a friendly smile and a bottle of whiskey, pretending to be a fellow prospector, and how her father had trusted him right up until the moment Sterling put a gun to his head and demanded the location of the richest vein. "I hid," she confessed one evening as they sat on a bench outside the general store, watching the sun paint the mountains gold and crimson. "I heard the shot and I hid like a coward instead of trying to help him." "You were wise," Garrett said firmly. "If you had shown yourself, Sterling would have killed you too. Your father would not have wanted that. I keep wondering if there was something I could have done differently. If I had screamed or fought or something, anything other than just hiding and listening to him die." Garrett shifted on the bench so he could look at her directly. "Kathryn, you did the only thing you could do. You survived. And because you survived, Sterling will eventually face justice for what he did. That matters, does it?" She turned to him, letting him see the guilt and grief she usually kept hidden. "Justice will not bring my father back. It will not undo what happened." "No," Garrett agreed, "but it will prevent Sterling from doing the same thing to someone else. Your testimony matters. Your life matters. And I am grateful that you hid, because if you had not, I never would have met you." The words hung between them, loaded with meaning that Kathryn was not quite ready to examine. She looked away, focusing on the sunset, and felt Garrett's hand cover hers where it rested on the bench between them. "I am not trying to push you," he said quietly, "but I want you to know that I care about you, Kathryn, more than I probably should, given how short a time we have known each other, and I think maybe you might care about me too, just a little." Her first instinct was to deny it, to pull her hand away and rebuild the walls he had been steadily dismantling. But she was tired of lying, tired of pretending, tired of being alone with her fear. "I am terrified," she admitted, the words barely audible. "I am terrified that if I let myself care about you, something terrible will happen. That Sterling will come and you will get hurt trying to protect me. That I will lose someone else I care about and it will break me completely." "That is a risk," Garrett acknowledged. "Caring about people always is. But Kathryn, do not you think a life without caring, without connection, without love, is its own kind of death? You are so busy trying to protect yourself from being hurt that you are not really living." "I do not know how to stop being afraid," she whispered. "You do not have to stop being afraid. You just have to decide that some things are worth being afraid for." He squeezed her hand gently. "I am not asking for promises or declarations. I am just asking you to keep letting me walk you home. Keep talking to me. Keep letting me know you bit by bit." "Can you do that?" Kathryn looked at their joined hands, at the way his thumb traced small circles on her palm, and felt something shift inside her chest. It was terrifying and exhilarating and felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, not knowing if she would fly or fall. "Yes," she said finally. "I can do that." His smile was like sunrise, warm and full of promise. They sat on the bench until the stars came out, talking about nothing and everything, and Kathryn felt the tight knot of fear in her chest loosen just slightly. 2 more weeks passed in relative peace. Kathryn found herself laughing more, smiling at customers in the store, even accepting an invitation to Sunday dinner with Mrs. Patterson and the other boarders. The constant vigilance that had defined her life for 6 months began to ease, and she started to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could have a future here in Eldorado Canyon. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late September when James Sterling finally arrived. Kathryn was restocking shelves in the general store when the door opened, and she looked up automatically to greet the customer. The words died in her throat as she recognized the man standing in the doorway, his expensive suit and cold eyes exactly as she remembered them from her nightmares. "Hello, Kathryn," Sterling said, his voice smooth as silk and twice as deadly. "You led me on quite a chase. I am impressed." She dropped the box of candles she was holding, and they scattered across the floor with a clatter that brought Mr. Peterson hurrying from the back room. Kathryn's hand went automatically to the Derringer in her pocket, but Sterling saw the movement and shook his head slightly. "I would not do that if I were you," he said pleasantly. "I have 2 men outside watching this store. If anything happens to me, they have orders to start shooting, and they do not particularly care who gets hit in the crossfire. You would not want any innocent people to get hurt on your account, would you?" "What is going on here?" Mr. Peterson demanded, looking between them in confusion. "Nothing to concern yourself with," Sterling said, his eyes never leaving Kathryn's face. "Just a private conversation between old friends. Miss Greene, would you care to take a walk with me? We have so much to catch up on. I am not going anywhere with you." Kathryn was proud that her voice did not shake, even though her knees felt like water. "I think you will, if you want to keep your new friends safe. That cowboy who walks you home every evening, for instance. Garrett Daniels, I believe his name is. It would be a shame if something happened to him because you were being stubborn." The threat was clear, and Kathryn felt her blood turn to ice. Sterling had been watching her, learning her routines, identifying the people she cared about. He knew exactly which pressure points to push to make her cooperate. "Mr. Peterson, please go get Sheriff Hayes," she said, keeping her eyes locked on Sterling. "Tell him James Sterling is here." "The sheriff," Sterling laughed, a cold sound that held no humor. "By all means, summon the local law. I have nothing to hide. I came to Eldorado Canyon on legitimate business and happened to run into an old friend. That is not a crime." "You murdered my father," Kathryn said, her voice shaking with rage now instead of fear. You shot him in cold blood because he would not tell you where his silver claim was. Bold accusation. Sterling's smile did not waver. Do you have any proof? Any witnesses besides yourself? Because I think you will find that a jury is not likely to take the word of a hysterical woman over that of a respected businessman, especially when that woman has a history of mental instability. I am not mentally unstable. Are you sure? Because I have documentation that says otherwise. Medical reports, sworn statements, all suggesting that you suffered a breakdown after your father's tragic death and have been making wild accusations ever since. It is quite sad, really. Sterling stepped further into the store and Kathryn instinctively backed away. But I am a forgiving man, Kathryn. I am willing to overlook your slander if you are willing to be reasonable. Just tell me where your father's claim is located, sign over the rights, and you can go on with your life here. No one else needs to get hurt. No. The word came out stronger than she felt. I will not give you anything, and Sheriff Hayes will arrest you for murder. On what evidence? Sterling spread his hands in a gesture of innocence. But if you want to involve the local authorities, we can certainly do that. I am sure they will be very interested to learn about the reward I have posted for information leading to the recovery of one Kathryn Greene, wanted for embezzlement in Colorado. $500 is a lot of money in a town like this. I wonder how loyal your friends will be when that much cash is on the line. Kathryn stared at him, seeing the trap closing around her. He had planned this perfectly, building a false narrative that painted her as the criminal and himself as the victim. Even if she told Sheriff Hayes the truth, Sterling's money and influence would make the outcome uncertain at best. I see you are beginning to understand, Sterling said with satisfaction. So here is what is going to happen. You are going to come with me voluntarily. We are going to have a nice conversation about your father's claim, and then I will be on my way. No one needs to know I was even here. Or you can refuse, and I will make your life and the lives of everyone you care about in this town a living hell. The choice is yours. Before Kathryn could respond, the door opened again and Garrett walked in, his expression shifting from pleasant surprise to alarm as he registered the tension in the room. Kathryn, everything all right? His eyes moved to Sterling and his whole demeanor changed, his body shifting into a protective stance. Who is this? The famous Garrett Daniels, Sterling said smoothly. I have heard so much about you. I am James Sterling, an old family friend of Kathryn's from Colorado. He is not a friend, Kathryn said quickly. Garrett, this is the man who killed my father, the one I told you about. Garrett's jaw tightened and his hand moved to rest on the gun at his hip. Then I think you should leave, mister, right now. Is that a threat? Sterling's voice remained pleasant, but his eyes turned cold. Because making threats against an unarmed man is generally frowned upon by the law. And I do believe the sheriff would be very interested to know about your violent tendencies, especially given that you are harboring a known fugitive. She is not a fugitive, Garrett said, his voice deadly calm. And you are not unarmed. I can see the shoulder holster under your coat. So how about we drop the pretense and you tell me what you really want? Sterling's facade cracked slightly, a flash of annoyance crossing his features. What I want is for Miss Greene to return what belongs to me. A silver claim that her father stole information about from one of my prospectors. I am willing to pay fair market value for the rights, but I am not willing to continue this chase across the territories. It ends today, one way or another. That is a lie, Kathryn said fiercely. My father discovered that claim on his own. You tried to steal it from him and murdered him when he refused to tell you where it was. So you keep saying. Sterling's attention returned to her. But again, where is your proof? It is your word against mine, and we both know who a judge will believe." The standoff was interrupted by Mr. Peterson returning with Sheriff Hayes and 2 deputies. The sheriff took in the scene with sharp eyes, his hand resting on his gun belt. "I hear we have a situation," Hayes said. "Someone want to explain what is going on?" "Sheriff, I am glad you are here," Sterling said before anyone else could speak. "I am James Sterling from Silver Creek, Colorado. I have been pursuing Miss Greene here on a matter of embezzlement and theft. I have the documentation right here." He reached into his coat slowly, pulling out a sheaf of papers. "This is a warrant for her arrest, signed by Judge Morrison in Colorado Territory." Hayes took the papers and examined them, his expression unreadable. Kathryn felt her heart sink as she watched him read, seeing her slim hope of justice slipping away. "These look official," Hayes said slowly, "but they are also from another territory. I would need to verify their authenticity before I could act on them." "Of course," Sterling agreed smoothly. "I would expect nothing less from a thorough lawman. In the meantime, I would appreciate it if you would ask Miss Greene to refrain from making unfounded accusations against me. Slander is a serious offense." "He murdered my father," Kathryn said desperately, "in June, near Silver Creek. He shot him and left him to die because my father would not tell him where his silver claim was located. I was there. I saw it happen." Hayes looked at her with sympathy but also doubt. "That is a serious accusation, Miss Greene. Do you have any evidence?" "I am the evidence. I witnessed it." "But do you have anything else? Anyone else who can corroborate your story?" Kathryn opened her mouth and then closed it again, realizing she had nothing. She had been alone with her father in the wilderness when Sterling came. There had been no other witnesses, no physical evidence beyond her father's body, which Sterling had probably hidden or disposed of. It was her word against his, exactly as he had planned. "I see," Hayes said into the silence. "Well, this is a complicated situation. Mr. Sterling, I am going to need you to stay in town for a few days while I sort this out. I will send some wires, verify these documents, and look into Miss Greene's allegations. Until then, I would appreciate it if both of you avoided each other. No contact, no confrontations. Understood?" "Perfectly," Sterling said with a smile. "I will be staying at the Silver Dollar if you need me. And Sheriff, I would recommend posting a guard on Miss Greene, for her own safety, of course. A woman making such wild accusations might decide to run rather than face justice." The implication was clear. Sterling was ensuring that Kathryn would be watched, preventing her from fleeing but also making it difficult for her to make any move against him. Hayes seemed to understand this as well, his mouth pressing into a thin line. "I will decide what security measures are necessary," he said firmly. "Now, Mr. Sterling, I suggest you head over to the Silver Dollar. Miss Greene, you stay at the boarding house or here at the store. I will let you both know when I have more information." Sterling tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy and left, his expensive boots clicking on the wooden floor. The moment the door closed behind him, Kathryn felt her legs give out. Garrett caught her before she could fall, his strong arms supporting her weight as he guided her to the chair behind the counter. "I have him now," she whispered, staring at nothing. "He has thought of everything. He is going to get away with murder, and I am going to go to jail or hang for crimes I did not commit." "No," Garrett said fiercely, kneeling beside her chair so he could look into her eyes. "That is not going to happen. We will figure this out." Sheriff Hayes cleared his throat. "Miss Greene, I need you to tell me everything. From the beginning. Every detail you can remember." So she told the story again, from her father's discovery of the silver vein to Sterling's arrival at their camp to the cold-blooded murder she had witnessed. She described how she had hidden in the rocks while Sterling searched for her, How she had waited until dark to creep back and find her father's body cold in the dirt. How she had run with nothing but the clothes on her back and her father's notebook describing the location of the claim. "Do you still have this notebook?" Hayes asked sharply. Kathryn nodded. "It is hidden in my room at the boarding house. I was afraid to keep it with me in case Sterling's men searched me." "That notebook could be evidence," Hayes said. "If your father wrote about discovering the claim, if there is anything in his own hand that contradicts Sterling's story, it could cast doubt on his version of events." Hope flickered in Kathryn's chest, small but real. He wrote in it every day. His observations, his theories, his measurements. It was like a journal. "Then we need to get that notebook and keep it somewhere safe, somewhere Sterling cannot get to it." Hayes looked at Garrett. "Can you escort Miss Greene to the boarding house and retrieve it? I will come with you." They walked to the boarding house together, Garrett on one side and Sheriff Hayes on the other, while Kathryn felt like a prisoner being marched to the gallows. But when they reached her room and she retrieved the leather-bound notebook from its hiding place under the floorboard, seeing her father's familiar handwriting brought tears to her eyes. "He was a good man," she said, running her fingers over the ink-stained pages. "He had his faults, but he was honest and he worked hard. He deserved better than to be murdered for money." "Then let us make sure his killer pays for what he did," Hayes said, taking the notebook carefully. "I will read through this tonight and see what we have. In the meantime, Miss Greene, I meant what I said about staying put. Sterling is dangerous, and until I have enough evidence to arrest him, I need you to be careful." After Hayes left, Garrett insisted on staying at the boarding house, settling into a chair on the front porch despite Kathryn's protests. Mrs. Patterson brought him coffee and a blanket as the evening turned cold, seeming to understand that nothing would move him from his self-appointed guard duty. Kathryn watched him from her window, this man who had somehow become her anchor in the storm, and felt something shift in her chest. He had no obligation to help her, no reason to risk his life for a woman he had known only a few months. But there he sat, prepared to spend the night on a hard chair in the cold, simply because he had promised to keep her safe. She went downstairs and stepped out onto the porch, a quilt from her bed draped over her shoulders. "You should go home and sleep." "I will sleep here just fine," Garrett replied, though the chair looked profoundly uncomfortable. "Garrett." She sat down on the top step, pulling the quilt tighter around herself. "Why are you doing this? Really?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the dark street. "You remember what I said about waiting for the right person, someone I could genuinely like and respect?" "Yes. I found her." He looked at her then, and the emotion in his eyes made her breath catch. "I found her in a woman who was so scared she could barely stand, but still had the courage to keep going. Who was kind to customers at the store even when her own world was falling apart. Who made me laugh with her dry observations about the ridiculous men who tried to court her. Who trusted me enough to let me help her, even though trusting anyone terrified her." "Garrett, I am a mess," Kathryn said, her voice breaking. "I have more baggage than a cross-country stage, and a murderer is trying to frame me for crimes I did not commit. You could do so much better." "I do not want better," he said simply. "I want you, just as you are, baggage and all. I am in love with you, Kathryn Greene, and I will be damned if I am going to let James Sterling or anyone else hurt you." The declaration hung in the cold night air, and Kathryn felt tears spilling down her cheeks. She had spent so long believing that caring about anyone would only lead to pain, that love was a luxury she could not afford. But here was Garrett, offering his heart with no guarantees, no promises that everything would work out, just his steady presence and unwavering commitment. "I am scared," she admitted. "I am so scared of losing you the way I lost my father." "I know." Garrett stood and crossed to the steps, sitting down beside her so their shoulders touched. "But Kathryn, I am scared too. I am scared that if I do not tell you how I feel, I will regret it for the rest of my life. I am scared that Sterling will find a way to hurt you before we can stop him. I am scared of a dozen things, but I am more afraid of living my life without you than I am of anything Sterling can do to me." Kathryn turned to look at him, this man with his honest eyes and gentle strength, and felt the last of her walls crumble. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I have loved you since that first day, when you offered to help me get a horse and did not demand to know why I was running. You made me want to stop running, want to believe that maybe I could have a life again." Garrett cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "You can have a life. We can have a life together if you want that. But first we have to deal with Sterling." "How? He has thought of everything. Even if my father's notebook proves the claim was his, Sterling can still say my father stole the information. It is still my word against his." "Maybe. But tomorrow we are going to sit down with Sheriff Hayes and figure out if there is anything in that notebook that definitively proves your case. And if there is not, then we will find another way. We will wire every lawman between here and Colorado. We will track down every person who knew your father and can testify to his character. We will make enough noise that Sterling cannot make this disappear quietly." "That could take months," Kathryn said. "And Sterling will not wait that long. He will try something." "Probably," Garrett agreed. "Which is why I am not leaving you alone until this is resolved. I will sleep on Mrs. Patterson's porch. I will walk you to work. I will be your shadow until Sterling is behind bars where he belongs." Despite everything, Kathryn found herself smiling. "You are extraordinarily stubborn. You know that, so I have been told." He leaned in slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away, and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that was gentle and sweet and full of promise. Kathryn melted into it, her hands coming up to clutch his shirt, anchoring herself to this moment of hope in the midst of chaos. When they finally pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his, breathing in the familiar scent of hay and leather that always clung to him. "What if this does not work? What if Sterling wins?" "Then we will run," Garrett said simply. "We will go somewhere so remote that even Sterling's money cannot reach us. Canada, maybe, or down to Mexico. I do not care where we go as long as we are together." "You would do that?" "Give up your life here, Kathryn. You are my life now. Everything else is just details." She kissed him again, pouring all her fear and hope and love into the gesture, and felt him respond with equal intensity. They sat on the porch steps wrapped in the quilt, holding each other as the stars wheeled overhead, and for the first time in 6 months, Kathryn felt like she might actually survive this. The next morning, Sheriff Hayes summoned them to his office with news. He had spent half the night reading through her father's notebook and had found something interesting. "Your father was meticulous," Hayes said, spreading the notebook open on his desk. "He documented every day of his prospecting, including the people he met and the conversations he had. And here," he pointed to an entry from March, "he writes about encountering a man named James Sterling who was working a claim about 5 miles from his. Sterling was having no luck, and your father felt sorry for him, so he shared some of his expertise about reading the geology. So Sterling knew who my father was months before the murder," Kathryn said, leaning over to read the entry. "It gets better. Your father writes here that Sterling seemed overly interested in where he was working, kept trying to follow him back to his camp. Your father started taking different routes home to throw him off. He even writes," Hayes flipped to another page, "that he did not trust Sterling and thought the man was more interested in stealing claims than working his own. That is all good, But it still does not prove Sterling killed him, Garrett said, though hope was beginning to color his voice. No, but it establishes a pattern of behavior that contradicts Sterling's story. It shows your father was suspicious of him, which makes sense if Sterling later tried to rob and kill him. And there is more. Hayes pulled out a stack of telegrams. I wired the sheriff in Silver Creek like you asked. Turns out there have been 3 other prospectors who disappeared or died mysteriously after having successful claims near where Sterling was working. No proof connecting him, but enough of a pattern that the local law has been watching him. Kathryn felt her heart leap. So they will believe me. Not necessarily. Sterling is wealthy and well-connected, and the sheriff in Silver Creek is on his payroll like you said. But I also wired the territorial marshal. If we can make a strong enough case that Sterling is a serial killer targeting prospectors, the marshal will have the authority to investigate regardless of what the local sheriff wants. How long will that take? Garrett asked. The marshal should arrive in 2 or 3 days. In the meantime, I am going to keep a close eye on Sterling. He is not going anywhere without me knowing about it. They left the sheriff's office feeling cautiously optimistic, but that optimism evaporated when they stepped out onto the street and found Sterling waiting for them, leaning against a post with studied casualness. "Good morning," he said pleasantly. "I hope the sheriff is making progress on verifying those arrest warrants. I would hate to have to stay in this dusty little town any longer than necessary." "The sheriff is making progress," Garrett said, his voice carefully neutral. "Just not in the direction you are hoping for." Something dangerous flickered in Sterling's eyes. "Is that so? How unfortunate. I suppose I will have to take matters into my own hands." "You make any move against Kathryn, and I will make sure you regret it," Garrett said, stepping slightly in front of her in a protective gesture. "Such devotion." Sterling's smile turned cold. "It is almost romantic, but Mr. Daniels, you should know that threats do not scare me. I have dealt with bigger obstacles than one lovesick cowboy." "Then you have not been paying attention," Garrett replied, "because I am not making threats. I am making promises." The 2 men stared at each other, tension crackling in the air between them, until Sterling finally pushed away from the post with a laugh. "We will see," he said. "We will see how brave you are when the bodies start piling up." He tipped his hat mockingly and walked away, his expensive boots leaving prints in the dust. "He is going to do something," Kathryn said, her voice tight with fear. "Tonight, probably. He knows the marshal is coming and he is running out of time." "Let him try," Garrett said grimly. "Sheriff Hayes has deputies watching him, and I will be watching you. He makes one wrong move and we will have him." But that night, despite all their precautions, Sterling managed to slip away from his watchers. Kathryn was in her room at the boarding house when she heard the sound of breaking glass from downstairs. She grabbed her derringer and moved to the door, listening to the sounds of a scuffle in the front parlor. The building was on fire. She could smell smoke, hear the hungry crackle of flames. Someone was screaming, and she thought it might be Mrs. Patterson. Kathryn threw open her door and ran toward the stairs, but smoke was already billowing up, thick and choking. "Garrett," she shouted, though she knew he was supposed to be outside, standing guard. "Mrs. Patterson?" "Up here, Mrs." Patterson's voice came from down the hall. "I cannot get past the flames." Kathryn ran back and found the older woman huddled in the hallway with 2 other boarders, all of them coughing and terrified. The staircase was engulfed now, the fire spreading with unnatural speed, and Kathryn realized with sick certainty that this was no accident. Sterling had done this, set fire to the boarding house with all of them inside. "The window," Kathryn said, pulling Mrs. Patterson toward the nearest room. "We have to go through the window." They crowded into the small bedroom, and Kathryn threw open the window, looking down at the 10-foot drop to the ground below. It was survivable, but dangerous, especially for Mrs. Patterson, who had to be in her 60s. "You first," Kathryn said to the younger boarders. "Lower yourselves down as far as you can, then drop. Do not hesitate." The two women obeyed, climbing out and dropping with small screams of fear. Kathryn turned to help Mrs. Patterson, but the older woman was frozen with terror, unable to make herself climb out. "I cannot," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I cannot do it." "Yes, you can," Kathryn insisted, but the smoke was getting thicker now, and she could feel the heat of the fire through the floor. They were running out of time. "Kathryn," Garrett's voice came from below, and she looked down to see him positioning a ladder against the side of the building. Relief flooded through her so intensely she almost laughed. Of course he was here. He had promised to keep her safe, and Garrett Daniels kept his promises. He climbed the ladder with impressive speed and helped Mrs. Patterson through the window, supporting her weight as they descended together. Then he came back for Kathryn, his face streaked with soot and his eyes fierce with worry. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, running his hands over her arms and shoulders as if checking for injuries. "I am fine." "Where is Sterling?" Sheriff Hayes arrested him. He was watching the fire from across the street, and one of his men got nervous and ran. Confessed the whole thing. Sterling hired them to set the fire while he established an alibi. Kathryn sagged against him, the terror and relief combining into something that made her knees weak. "It is over." "It is over," Garrett confirmed, holding her tight against his chest. "Hayes has him in custody, and with his man's testimony plus your father's notebook, the marshal will have more than enough to charge him with murder. You are safe now. Finally safe." She buried her face in his shoulder and let herself cry, all the fear and grief and stress of the past months pouring out in great racking sobs. Garrett held her through it, his hand gentle on her back, murmuring reassurances that she could barely hear over the sound of her own crying. When the tears finally subsided, she pulled back enough to look at him. His face was dirty, his shirt torn, and she had never seen anything more beautiful in her life. "You saved me," she said. "You saved yourself," he corrected gently. "You got everyone out of that building." "I just provided the ladder, Garrett." She cupped his face in her hands, making him meet her eyes. "I love you. I trust you, completely. And I want to spend the rest of my life proving to you that your faith in me was not misplaced." His smile started slow and spread like sunrise. "Is that a proposal, Miss Greene?" "I suppose it is." She found herself smiling back despite the smoking ruin of the boarding house behind them. "What do you say, Mr. Daniels? Think you can put up with a woman who has more baggage than the Territorial Railroad?" "I think," he said, pulling her close again, "that I am the luckiest man in Nevada Territory." He kissed her there in the street, in front of the burning building and the gathering crowd and Sheriff Hayes, who was leading Sterling away in shackles. Kathryn kissed him back with all the hope and love and trust that she had thought she would never feel again, and knew that she was finally, truly home. The territorial marshal arrived 3 days later, and, after reviewing the evidence, formally charged James Sterling with the murder of Kathryn's father and 3 other prospectors. The trial was scheduled for Denver in November, and Kathryn would have to testify, but with Sterling's hired man turned witness and the evidence in her father's notebook, the outcome seemed certain. Garrett and Kathryn were married in early October, in a simple ceremony at the small church in Eldorado Canyon. Mrs. Patterson, recovered from her ordeal and living temporarily at the Silver Dollar, cried through the entire service. Mr. Peterson gave the bride away, and Sheriff Hayes stood up as Garrett's best man. It was nothing like the grand wedding Kathryn had dreamed of as a girl, but it was perfect in every way that mattered. They made their home in a small house near the livery stable, close enough that Garrett could walk to work but far enough to feel private. Kathryn continued working at the general store, finding satisfaction in the honest work and friendly customers. Her father's silver claim, once probated through the courts, turned out to be as rich as he had believed. She sold it to a mining company for enough money to ensure their future security, but kept her job anyway, enjoying the routine and the sense of purpose it gave her. The trial in Denver went exactly as hoped. Sterling was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to hang. Kathryn had thought she would feel satisfaction at the verdict, but instead she just felt tired and sad. Her father was still dead, and no amount of justice would bring him back. But at least other prospectors would be safe from Sterling's greed, and that counted for something. By Christmas, Kathryn discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with joy and terror in equal measure, and she found herself standing at the window of their little house, one hand on her still flat belly, wondering if she was ready to be a mother. "You will be wonderful," Garrett said, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "Our child could not ask for a braver, stronger mother." "What if I am not enough?" Kathryn leaned back against his chest, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "What if something happens and I cannot protect them?" "Then we will figure it out together," Garrett said simply. "That is what partners do. You do not have to face anything alone anymore, Kathryn, not ever again." Their son was born in August of 1879, during a rare summer rainstorm that broke the desert heat and left the air smelling clean and new. They named him Robert, after Kathryn's father, and he came into the world with a healthy set of lungs and a full head of dark hair. Holding her son for the first time, Kathryn felt something settle in her chest that she had not even realized was unbalanced. This was what her father had wanted for her, not the silver or the wealth, but this sense of family and home and belonging. She wished he could have met his grandson, could have seen that his death had not been entirely in vain, that some good had come from the tragedy. "He would be proud of you," Garrett said softly, as if reading her thoughts. He sat on the edge of the bed, looking at his wife and newborn son with an expression of such love that it made Kathryn's throat tighten. "Your father, he would be so proud of the woman you have become." "I hope so," Kathryn said, tracing her finger over Robert's tiny hand. "I am going to make sure he knows about his grandfather, about how brave and smart and hardworking Robert Greene was, how he dared to dream of something better and worked himself to the bone trying to achieve it. And we will make sure he knows about his mother," Garrett added. "About how brave and strong and incredible she is. How she survived something that would have broken most people and came out the other side still kind and still capable of love." They sat together in the afternoon light, the rain pattering on the roof, their son sleeping peacefully between them. It was a quiet moment, unremarkable in most ways, but Kathryn knew she would remember it for the rest of her life. This was the moment she stopped being a survivor and started being simply a woman, loved and loving, building a life with the man who had waited patiently until she learned to trust again. As the years passed, their family grew. A daughter arrived 2 years after Robert, and they named her Caroline after Kathryn's mother. Then another son, whom they called Thomas. The house near the livery stable grew too small, so they built a larger one on the edge of town, with a porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sun set over the mountains. Garrett expanded his business, eventually opening a ranch where he bred and trained horses. Kathryn invested some of the money from her father's claim in the venture, and together they built something successful and lasting. She still worked at the general store a few days a week, enjoying the social interaction and the sense of contributing to the community. Eldorado Canyon thrived and grew, evolving from a rough mining camp into a proper town with a school, 3 churches, and even a small opera house. Kathryn and Garrett became pillars of the community, known for their generosity and their willingness to help newcomers find their footing in the harsh Nevada desert. On quiet evenings when the children were asleep and the house was still, Kathryn would sometimes take out her father's old notebook and read his entries. His handwriting, once so familiar, had become precious to her, a tangible connection to the man who had shaped her early life. She would trace the ink with her fingers and remember the good times before the silver and the obsession, when it had been just the 2 of them against the world. "You ever regret it?" Garrett asked one such evening, finding her curled up in their favorite chair with the notebook open on her lap. "Coming west, I mean. Everything that happened." Kathryn considered the question seriously. "I regret that my father died. I regret that I had to see what I saw and survive what I survived. But do I regret the path that brought me to you? Never. Not for a single moment." He pulled her up from the chair and into his arms, and she went willingly, resting her head on his shoulder. After all these years, his embrace still felt like the safest place in the world. "I love you," he murmured into her hair. "I have loved you since that first day when you dropped to the ground at the sound of a gunshot and came up with a derringer in your hand, fierce and terrified and absolutely beautiful." "I love you too," Kathryn replied. "Thank you for waiting. Thank you for being patient when I did not know how to trust. Thank you for showing me that not all men are like James Sterling, that some men actually keep their promises." "Always," Garrett said simply. "I will always keep my promises to you." They stood like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms, listening to the peaceful sounds of their home settling around them. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed 9 times, and upstairs one of the children stirred in their sleep. These were the moments Kathryn treasured most, the ordinary domestic scenes that proved she had survived, that she had healed, that she had built something good from the ashes of tragedy. By the time Robert was old enough to ask questions about his grandfather, Kathryn had made peace with the past. She told her son stories about Robert Greene, about his determination and his dreams, about how he had worked hard and dared to hope for something better. She told him about the silver claim and the murder, but she focused more on the lessons, about courage in the face of adversity, about the importance of honesty and hard work, about choosing love over fear. "Your grandfather would have loved you," she told Robert one evening as they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. "He would have been so proud to see the fine young man you are becoming. Do you miss him?" Robert asked with the directness of a child. "Every day," Kathryn admitted, "but I am also grateful for the life I have now. Your father, you and your siblings, our home and our friends. My father's death was a terrible thing, but it led me here to Eldorado Canyon to your father. And I cannot regret the path that brought me to this family." Robert considered this, his young face serious in the fading light. "Papa says you are the bravest person he knows." "Your papa is biased," Kathryn said with a smile. "But I hope I have taught you that bravery is not about not being afraid. It is about being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway, about trusting people even when it is hard, about choosing to love even when love makes you vulnerable." "I think I understand," Robert said, though Kathryn suspected he would not truly grasp the lesson until he was older, until he had faced his own trials and made his own choices about whether to trust or retreat. The years continued to pass, marked by small joys and minor sorrows, by births and deaths and all the messy complexity of a life fully lived. Kathryn's hair began to show threads of silver, and Garrett developed laugh lines around his eyes from years of smiling. They grew old together, gracefully and gratefully, never taking for granted the gift of their partnership. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Garrett surprised her with a trip back to Missouri, to the small town where she had grown up. The place had changed dramatically in the decades since she had left, but she found her mother's grave and stood beside it for a long time, telling her mother about her life, about her children, about the man who had waited patiently until she could trust again. "I think she would have liked you," Kathryn said to Garrett as they walked back through the cemetery. "My mother. She always said I should find someone kind and steady, someone who would be a true partner. You are all of that and more." "I am just a man who got lucky," Garrett replied. "Lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time. Lucky enough to convince a scared woman that not everyone would hurt her. Lucky enough to spend my life with the most remarkable person I have ever met." They returned to Eldorado Canyon after 2 weeks, eager to be back in their own home, surrounded by their children and grandchildren. The town had continued to grow in their absence, with new businesses opening and new families arriving. But the core remained the same, built on the work and dedication of people like Kathryn and Garrett, who had chosen to make this harsh, beautiful place their home. In the evenings, Kathryn would sit on the porch with Garrett, their hands linked together, watching the sun set over the mountains that had witnessed so much of their life together. She would think about that frightened young woman who had climbed down from the stagecoach so many years ago, gripping a derringer and trusting no one. She would think about the patient cowboy who had offered help without demands, who had waited as long as necessary for her to learn to trust again. And she would feel grateful, deeply and profoundly grateful, for every moment of the life they had built together. For the fear that had taught her caution, for the love that had taught her courage, for the partner who had shown her that trust was not a weakness but a gift to be given and received. "What are you thinking about?" Garrett would ask, squeezing her hand. "About how far we have come," Kathryn would reply. "About how that scared young woman in 1878 never could have imagined all of this. About how glad I am that you did not give up on me." "I never would have," Garrett would say, the same steady promise he had made decades ago. "I told you I would wait until you could trust me. Best decision I ever made." And Kathryn would lean her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, and know that she was finally, completely, permanently home. Not just in Eldorado Canyon, not just in their house with the wide porch, but here, in this relationship with this man who had seen her at her most broken and had chosen to love her anyway. The story that had begun with a gunshot and a derringer, with fear and flight and desperate survival, had become something else entirely. It had become a story about healing, about trust rebuilt piece by patient piece, about love that was strong enough to wait and gentle enough to allow for fear. Years later, when Kathryn was an old woman with grandchildren climbing on her lap, they would ask her to tell them stories about the old days, about the Wild West, and the adventures she had lived. She would tell them about silver mines and stagecoaches, about Nevada deserts and Colorado mountains, about a brave man who had stood up to a murderer and waited patiently for love to grow in wounded soil. But the story she loved telling most was simpler than that. It was about a cowboy who had knelt beside a frightened woman in the dust of an Eldorado Canyon street and offered kindness without expecting anything in return. About a woman who had trembled and said she could not trust anyone, and a man who had nodded and replied that he would wait until she could trust him. It was a story about keeping promises, about patience and persistence, about love that was willing to wait for however long it took. And it was a story with the best kind of ending, the kind where two broken people found each other and built something whole, something lasting, something worth waiting for. In the end, that was what mattered most. Not the silver or the danger or the dramatic rescues, but the quiet moments of trust given and received, of promises made and kept, of love that grew slowly and surely until it became the foundation of everything else. Kathryn Greene Daniels lived to be 83 years old, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who bore her courage and Garrett's kindness in their bones. And when she finally closed her eyes for the last time, it was with Garrett's hand in hers and his voice in her ear, reminding her one final time that he loved her, that he was grateful for every moment they had shared, that waiting for her had been the easiest and best decision he had ever made. Their story became legend in Eldorado Canyon, told and retold until it took on the quality of myth. But those who had known them, who had seen them walk together through the streets for decades, knew that the truth was simpler and more beautiful than any legend could capture. They had simply been two people who found each other when they needed each other most, who chose love over fear, trust over suspicion, patience over pressure. And they had built a life together that proved, beyond any doubt, that sometimes the best things are worth waiting for.